Hello, everyone. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of Congress and constitutional reform. This event, which we're proud to be co-hosting with the Henry Salvatori Center at Claremont McKenna College, is for us an element of AI's longstanding and growing commitment to constitutional scholarship, which is embodied in our new Center on American Constitutional Governance, and in the work of scholars of Congress, the presidency, the judiciary, the party system, and the electoral system. Scholars like our new colleagues, Kevin Kosar and Philip Wallach, who you'll hear from today. Our work is devoted to strengthening and revitalizing the American constitutional system, and at the center of any such effort has to be a commitment to a strong and vibrant Congress, which is the subject of today's discussion. I'll just briefly introduce our moderator for this morning, Zachary Corser from Claremont McKenna, and he will then introduce the panelists and launch the discussion. At the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to engage with the panel for Q&A. And I do want to mention that there are two ways you can pose questions, by email or through Twitter. You can email your question to Nicole Penn, whose email is nicole.penn, P-E-N-N, @aei.org, or you can tweet them at us at the hashtag AEI Congress. And so a few words about our moderators. Zach Corser is a professor of government at Claremont McKenna College and co-director of the Policy Lab there. He's written widely for both academic and popular audiences, especially about the connection between political parties and democratic participation. And he's been leading a project on earmark reform at CMC's Policy Lab that will soon be reporting recommendations. He holds a PhD from the University of Virginia. So with that, I'll turn things over to Zach, who will introduce the panel and start things off. Zach?
Thanks so much, Yuval, both for the introduction and for providing a space for these kinds of discussions. I think it's really important to be thinking about our institutions, not simply in an academic perspective, but in a broader context where we can all talk and engage about how our constitutional institutions are serving us, or in this case, maybe not, and ways that we can think about reform. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm also honored to have such a distinguished panel to discuss these questions. It's a pleasure for me to introduce them. I'm just going to go in alphabetical order here. First, Kevin Kosar. He's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institution, and he launched the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group in 2016 together with Lee Drutman at New America. He's also a former editor of legbranch.org, which is an outgrowth of the Capacity Working Group that is a centerpiece for, and I think a leader really in talking about the sort of nascent congressional reform movement that we're seeing in Washington, D.C. that's focused on improving our nation's legislative branch's performance and thinking about its role in separation of powers. He's also the co-editor recently of a book entitled Congress Overwhelmed, Decline in Congressional Capacity and Prospects for Reform, which is obviously very appropriate for our conversation today. It's going to be released next month, so go to Amazon or wherever you buy your books and order it now. You'll find within it a lot of ideas for analyzing Congress's current difficulties and thinking about ways in which Congress can improve upholding their Article I responsibilities. I'm also happy to say that Kevin and I have worked for the last year together with the Policy Lab on earmarking reform. It's been a pleasure and looking forward to moving forward to our final memo. I'm also very pleased to introduce Molly Reynolds. She's a senior fellow in government studies at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the US Senate. She looks into how early 70s budget reform led to really important changes and exceptions to the Senate's traditional embrace of unlimited debate and the emergence of majoritarian politics in the chamber. That's an important lesson for all of us to learn about. Her current research includes work on oversight in the House of Representatives, congressional reform, and the congressional budget process. So Molly, it's terrific to have you here. Also very pleased to introduce Jeffrey Tulis. He's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of The Rhetorical Presidency, a very important contribution to our understanding of how the modern executive competes with Congress for the public's attention. It received the American Political Science Association's Legacy Award in 2018, and it's certainly something I think every American graduate student has had the pleasure to read during their time in graduate school. I certainly did. He's written widely on subjects relating to the presidency, and he's also currently working on a book entitled Congressional Abdication, which is a subject we'll be touching on very soon here, that will be published by Princeton University Press. So we're very pleased to have you. And then last but certainly not least, Philip Wallach. He's a resident scholar at AEI. He researches separation of powers and executive and congressional relations. Before EI, he was a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where he authored To the Edge, Legality, Legitimacy, and Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. He's also served as a fellow with the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which, if you're not familiar with this committee, it was formed by Speaker Pelosi to look into Congress and its operations, and to look into ways in which there could be some meaningful reforms made to increase Congress's capacity. So he's got a lot of firsthand experience and understanding of how Congress is thinking about itself in terms of reform. He's also a regular contributor to the aforementioned ledgebranch.org. So Philip, pleasure to have you here as well. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the Constitution and talking about Congress as an institution, and also bringing in James Madison to this discussion. Particularly, I wanted to start with something I think, I was talking about how graduate students read the rhetorical presidency. Every introductory government student is going to read at least 2 Federalist papers, I hope. They're going to be reading Federalist 10 and also Federalist 51. And in 51, they're going to learn and imbibe this notion that separation of powers is an idea that if you give powers to certain branches to which they can defend themselves against encroachments by other branches, it's just sort of a rock-ribbed assumption of American politics that these other branches will defend themselves and understand their prerogatives. Madison, he famously wrote in 51, "The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place." And I think it's fair to say that he expected that giving Congress sufficient powers would necessarily cause its members to defend their own institutional prerogatives against the encroachment of other branches. And yet in our own time, it certainly seems that Congress seems eager to abdicate its responsibilities, both to the executive, but also to the courts. So Professor Toulis, the first question goes to you. Was Madison essentially wrong in making this calculation about separation of powers?
Thank you, Zach. So when you gave me advance warning of your first question, you said I might be able to lay out a little bit more expositively an answer to it. The answer is sort of yes and no, so that's why it'll have to be a little bit expositive. But let me frame it by suggesting that the entire panel today, I think, was inviting and attracted readers, viewers rather, who are interested and already think that there's a big problem that needs to be solved, and they're interested in processes of reform of the Congress. And my fellow panelists, I think, actually know a lot more than I do about the varieties of possible reforms that might be appropriate. They also are concerned, as I am more concerned than with reform, with diagnosing what it is that is the problem and what might be some of the causes of it. So I thought I'd take my few opening remarks to just sketch that, because it's an elaboration of this issue. Why is it that ambition does not counteract ambition, and that the interests of the office holders in the Congress are not connected to the institutional interests of Congress? And it begins with what you noted, that there's really been a massive change between the 19th and earliest 20th century in the United States in what could be called congressional culture. Congress simply worked differently before, in which it was actually the case that individuals translated their partisan perspectives, their partisan views, their policy views into institutional arguments. There was a kind of constitutional literacy in the past, particularly among office holders, but even among the citizenry, where we have ignorance now. With respect to the citizenry, I would just mention that you could get large crowds to sit in rapt attention to follow the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the 19th century. It's unimaginable now. There was institutional loyalty in the past, and there's a kind of subversion of the institution now. Now, in the 19th and earliest 20th centuries, there were political parties, and there was at times political polarization. And yet, despite this fact, we had this kind of institutional robustness that you alluded to. There is obviously political polarization now, but it's different. And one of the differences is the idea of hyperpartisanship, a notion that has been really well developed, I think, by your AEI colleague Norm Ornstein and his Brookings colleague, Tom Mann, in their trilogy of books on Congress. But I think it can be illustrated vividly for viewers by just thinking about two sets of people that are familiar. One would be the recently late Senator Byrd from Virginia, who served the longest of any senator in American history in the Senate and was majority leader many times and was 4 times president pro tem and so forth. And compare him with John McCain, Mitch McConnell, and Lindsey Graham on the other, for purposes of your topic. Byrd carried a constitution actually around with him in his pocket, which he would pull out and cite to fellow congressmen. In the 19th century, you didn't have to do that. And in fact, Byrd didn't need it for his own memory. But more interestingly, Byrd often stood up for the Senate in the following manner. He would actually oppose a president of his own party on a policy matter with which he was in full agreement himself, and of course, which his party was in full agreement with. This happened a number of times when Bill Clinton was president, in order to stand up for the prerogatives of the Senate, even if that would slow the policy down and possibly kill the policy under dispute because of this longer term fidelity to the Senate. Now, what's interesting is that though he was a majority leader, and though he had power and position, he was also thought to be a kind of odd duck, crazy sort of guy, that he was a sort of throwback, an anachronism, a throwback to some past time. And that's because that's exactly what he was. He was an oddball in the 20th century, but would have been perfectly familiar in the early 20th or 19th century. Now, and one additional fact, he started out his life founding a chapter and leading it of the Ku Klux Klan. And toward the end of his life, he was honored by the NAACP for his championing of civil rights. So there's probably no senator that illustrates the proposition that institutional place can be the lens through which, and personal ambition can be the lens through which, or the mechanism through which the Constitution reshapes one's political consciousness. And Byrd, over the course of his life, not only apologized for his earlier self, but he recognized that he came, as he matured, to better articulate what he's thought to be the Constitution's aspirations. So you could say he went from bad to good by virtue of his institutional position. Now, John McCain is interesting because he's the lead example in Norm Ornstein and Mann's book that I alluded to. When Obama becomes president, he decides that one of his first acts is going to be to illustrate his campaign promise to be post-partisan. One of his first acts is to reintroduce a bill that had not been enacted, that was McCain's bill. McCain had authored it. And Mitch McConnell had announced the proposition that whatever Obama did was going to be opposed by the party opposite by virtue of the fact that Obama was doing it in order to make it less likely that he could be successfully reelected. That's hyperpartisanship. And McCain actually did it. He actually voted against his own idea. That's new. That's really new. That's what hyperpartisanship is. It's also new to find, as we did during the impeachment process with McConnell and Graham, that when confronted with not only their oath of office that they had taken to become senators, but the new oath of office that they had to take to become sort of judges qua jurors in an impeachment trial, for which the Constitution provides there be a new oath, they mocked that oath. They actually said they weren't in effect going to follow it, or they could care less about it. That is stunning when one thinks about it. It's stunning because it's not unusual for people to fail to live up to an oath, but it's highly unusual for people to actually disavow an oath. It'd be like somebody before they got married the night before at some party saying, my prospective spouse, I'm going to be saying all this bullshit tomorrow, but I don't really believe any of it. And then presumably if the spouse heard it, that should be enough to say, maybe this isn't the way I want to go. That's exactly what happened. Now, until Donald Trump, what looked like an imperial presidency was actually the abject deference of Congress. So we had lots of literature, starting with Arthur Schlesinger, about the imperial presidency. But presidents actually looked more imperial than they were, because they actually pushed the boundaries of their office in ways that the Constitution not only anticipated but encouraged, without the pushback from Congress that you had alluded to. And finally, and related to that point, what looks like too much contestation and gridlock today is actually the result of too much deference in the past. And by the way, bipartisan deference often in the past. So the longer diagnostic story would be the abandonment and misunderstanding of what is wrongly called separation of powers. And we could talk about that later, because the Constitution has no separation of powers clause. It has a much more new and complicated theory about the relationship between the president and Congress. And the memory of that complicated theory has been lost. Just a few words on the possible causes of this change. The first point that related to what I just said, the mislabeling of separation of powers, has led over time to the legalization of things that were previously political disputes. So things that Congress and the president used to argue about themselves in constitutional terms and resolve themselves have been taken by them, both president and Congress, to the courts to arbitrate. And the courts have in recent years increasingly taken these cases that they had previously declined. Secondly, there may have been a generational change, and this goes more directly to the question you asked, Zach, a generational change such that over the first, or more than first, 5 decades or so of the Republic, what we thought was a constitutional design that actually produced this robust, constitutionally fructifying contestation might actually have been the result of an earlier civic education produced by Republican notions that had actually been abandoned by the Constitution. Under the Constitution, the institutions in effect were supposed to teach the office holders how to behave without an actually prescribed civic education or any mechanisms of civic education. And it looked like it was working, but maybe it wasn't really working. Maybe what looked like what was working was actually a residue of the pre-constitutional, constitutional and civic culture. Thirdly, the Constitution's commitment to an administrative republic, not just in a republic, but administrative republic, rather than, for example, a deliberative republic, or more of a commitment to an administrative republic, might have contributed to this phenomenon, because so much of Congress's normal legislative behavior has been delegated away to administrative agencies for rulemaking and so forth. Fourth, progressive reforms, such as making the presidency more democratic, might have contributed to this issue, because Congress was supposed to be the more democratic institution, and the presidency has sucked away some of that source of Congress's legitimacy. And finally, as I previously mentioned, there may have been a conservative backlash in the long term to progressive reforms that have resulted in hyperpartisanship as a strategy to win power, irrespective of the policy consequences. Now, these big causes have played out differently in different domains. And so the way that Congress has abdicated its responsibility has been different depending what the arena was. So, for example, in appointments, Congress has declined to use powers that it has. In budget, it has developed mechanisms of pre-commitment, of attempts to, in advance, make mechanisms to deal with its own pathologies. But these have failed because they have not made such pre-commitments to deal with all of its pathologies. In war and foreign affairs, Congress has sometimes attempted to solve its own problem by creating super statutes or constitution-like statutes, such as the War Powers Resolution, which may have ironically contributed to the problem that it was designed to solve by convincing congressmen that pieces of legislation had done their job for them, so that they no longer had to exercise or utilize the constitutional powers and responsibilities that they have. So I hope that sort of sets the table for you, Zach.
It's very helpful. Thank you, Jeff. I mean, you've raised a number of different points, nuanced points that relate to changes in political culture, maybe some false assumptions about some civic education and how those would inform action, our understanding of the Constitution, the rise of polarization. There's a lot to consider, and we'll be touching on those themes as we ask other questions. But I just to sort of bring it up to date, I just wanted to ask one follow-up question about the recent impeachment this year. We had our own sort of very public airing of disputes between Congress and the presidency, and it's a very recent example of Congress attempting to exert its power over the executive, albeit failed. And I guess I'm wondering, are there some lessons, do you think, that Congress can learn from its failure in how it could, thinking for the future, restore its capacities to more effectively police executive power?
I do. And I think the big lesson to take away from impeachment is that both the senators, and to some degree the House members, and certainly the polity at large and journalists, misunderstood that the important charges were actually the ones that dealt with obstruction of Congress. Those were the most important charges for the topic that we're pursuing today. And the reason those were the most important charges is that all of Congress's tools for extracting information, for oversight, for all the things that Congress does in its interaction with the president, depend ultimately on the ability to punish the president if the issue is deemed by them serious enough that they need the information, witnesses, or whatever it is that's not being supplied. So impeachment and conviction doesn't need to be used often in order for it to serve this absolutely crucial function, which is that separation of what we call separation of powers, this more complex theory of the relationship between president and Congress, simply does not work if, in fact, Congress doesn't have the last word. Some people think that separation of powers, or the notion of coordinate and co-equal branches, means that these institutions have the same power over time at any given moment. But in fact, one of the complications of our theory the American theory, is that the president is supposed to have more power at the beginning of a policy cycle, or, for example, with respect to national security at the beginning of war and so forth. Presidents are in a position that they can start things. But in order for things to actually be coordinate and co-equal, it has to be the case that the president's prospective advantages, that we have vested the president with executive power precisely because the citizenry as a whole and legislators as representatives are not as good seeing into the future in general as would be a well-constructed executive. But similarly, a well-constructed executive cannot be as good as the citizenry in general or a legislature in looking backward retrospectively, evaluating things, because partly what they're evaluating is the effect that the decisions have had on the polity. In any event, in order for the Congress to actually vindicate its perspective, it has to be that in the end, it is superior, just as at the beginning, the president is. So impeachment is absolutely vital. And the legalization of the impeachment process during the Andrew Johnson impeachment was the beginning of the end, but its resuscitation, the sort of Johnson defense resuscitation in our own time, is very, very damaging to separation of powers. And the lack of cognizance of how important those obstruction of Congress charges really were is a serious, serious problem, because it has the long-term consequences of just teaching future presidents that they simply don't have to give up information and so forth.
It's really interesting that Congress misdiagnosed what was most important in terms of its institutional powers in the impeachment fight. I'm going to turn attention here to Kevin, but not turn away from Madison quite yet. Because another assumption that Madison made about the powers of Congress, when we talk about separation of powers, when we talk about the things that Congress, the tools that Congress has in order to affect its desires, to affect its legislative will, one of the most essential is the spending power, the power of the purse, as it's called. And Madison was not stinting in his expectation that this power of the purse would be one of the most powerful things that Congress would have in dealing with problems that may arise or challenges to its power. I'm going to quote him now from Federalist 58. Madison wrote, "The power over the purse may be, in fact, regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representative of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure." But it seems fairly clear that possessing this power of the purse hasn't been a cure-all for, quote, every grievance. So, Kevin, can you tell us a little bit in your thoughts about how Congress has lost its way on effectively employing this power of the purse?
Sure. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, one does get the sense that the power of the purse has been weakened over time. It's not dead yet, but it's not what we might wish. Conceptually, the power of the purse is fairly straightforward. It requires that somebody in Congress, A, care about what an executive agency is doing, and B, exert herself to turn off the money if the agency is failing to follow the law or congressional directives. It's a really basic principal agent type relationship, and it can occur either through the authorizations process or the appropriations process. But we're not seeing a whole lot of that. You can find it in some places. I mean, the National Defense Authorization Act, the committees in charge of that are very active in thinking about where money should be spent and where it should not be spent. But as a general proposition, yeah, the power of the purse is weakened. And there are all sorts of factors that have caused this weakening of the purse. And I'll highlight just 5 of them. First is lobbying. Around 25 years ago, Jonathan Rauch, who's now at the Brookings Institution with Molly, he wrote a book called Demosclerosis, which showed how hard it can be for Congress to kill off any program or any agency, no matter how wasteful or ineffective they may be. There's a pluralism at work and all sorts of other stuff that just leads to the perpetuation of agencies and programs, whether a majority wants them there or not. A second factor in the weakening of the purse is government giganticism. Last time I looked, the federal government was around a $4.5 trillion operation. That's certainly going up this year. And it had more than 170 executive agencies and just innumerable programs. And Congress right now just does not appear to have the capacity to oversee something that immense and complex with any sort of rigor or consistency. This leads to the third factor, which is or perhaps an outcome of the second factor to some degree, is that there's been a breakdown in the reauthorizations process. What's supposed to happen is that virtually every agency gets created by law for a period of time, or a program gets created by law for a period of time. And as that period nears its conclusion, Congress is supposed to consider whether to reauthorize the agency or program and to make adjustments. Agency X don't spend money on program Y, spend money on policy B instead. But the data are quite clear. Scott Adler out at University of Colorado has been working this topic for a long time. And he's shown that Congress is really just not doing a whole lot of reauthorizations. The laws authorizing agencies and programs will expire, and Congress and the appropriators just keep appropriating money to them. And this business today of where we govern by continuing resolutions, which simply continue current executive branch policies and processes, that's become the norm. And so that's a real sign of a weakening of the power of the purse. A fourth factor I want to mention is the flow of spending authority from the legislative to the executive branch. In some instances, Congress just delegates its fiscal power to the executive branch, and sometimes the executive branch just takes it. So an example of the former is that Congress over the decades has made a practice of giving agencies more and more power basically to fund themselves in the form of fines, fees, settlements, and the like. And very frequently, agencies are not given a whole lot of direction about how they're supposed to spend the money that they're bringing in through fines, fees, settlements, and the like. An example of the executive branch simply just taking spending power, well, one sees that all the time. Just this past month, the Trump administration decided to take $300 million from the Centers for Disease Control and shift it over to Department of Health and Human Services and devote that money for a public advertising campaign to kind of buck Americans up and make them feel a little less bad about the coronavirus. The administration just did it. There was no clear statutory authorization for them to do that. Congress had certainly not signaled that they wanted Trump administration to do it, but the administration did it. And Congress subsequently has been left scrambling, trying to stop it. Which leads me to one last factor I wanted to mention, and that is interest, which I use in the Madisonian sense. You've quoted Madison a bit already, and in Federalist 51, he said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and the interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. I think that over at least the last 20 years, a lot of incoming legislators have been socialized to not see their interest as connected with wielding the power of the purse. I think a lot of members of Congress don't think much about using the power of the purse to pursue things that are advantageous to them. And so we've got this unfortunate dynamic where, those of us who are kind of in the business of trying to make Congress great again, we tromp down to Capitol Hill and we talk to Congress about oversight, talk to staff about oversight, and you sometimes feel like you're, shoving a big bowl of kale in front of them and saying, eat your kale, it's good for you. And they just don't show a whole lot of fire in their belly for doing that. They don't want to use the power of the purse very frequently, unless it's for some sort of partisan purpose, to beat up on the administration. And so that's where we're at right now. And it's a way more complex story than that as far as how the power of the purse kind of slipped away from Congress. But it's a real problem, because it's just core to having representative government, is that the legislature has to have some level of forceful direction in the allocation of public resources.
Thank you, Kevin. After talking to you and Jeff, I'm starting to get the idea that there's an article to be written called "Congress, the Sleeping Giant," as we talk about its capacities potentially under the Constitution, and yet its modesty or its forgetfulness about its powers. And along those lines, Kevin, I wanted to follow up a little bit when you say, going to the Hill and talking to legislators, and I think this is also useful to following up on what Jeff was saying about changing understandings or even attention to the Constitution, or a constitutional view of Congress's powers. I'm curious to learn a bit more about your experience in this congressional reform movement that's currently underway, and get your sense of just how serious policymakers are about restoring Congress's diminished capacities. Do they either acknowledge that Congress's capacities are diminished, and B, are they really actively engaged in reform and attempting to sort of bring this ship to right?
I should mention that I worked for the Congressional Research Service inside the Library of Congress from 2003 to 2014. And I was a civil servant, and I was helping, Dems, Republicans, everybody, committees, members, staff from the most senior to the most junior. And one thing I took away from that experience was that there was a remarkable consistency of this feeling on the Hill of, I could liken it to learned helplessness, where you have folks say, Congress is not working. Oh, I can't get anything done. I'm so disappointed. This place is so partisan. Everything is terrible. You got the feeling that people kind of came to the Capitol with high hopes and wishes and dreams, and they wanted to serve the public and all that. And they were just finding their day-to-day lives to be such a drag. And that's, completely understandable, but Congress is also this institution that has this remarkable power. It can fund itself as much as it wants. It can organize itself as it sees fit. It has all sorts of discretion to kind of fix problems, change the way it operates, but that wasn't being done. People would complain, but there wasn't a whole lot of energy being put into pursuing substantive reforms that could make everybody's life better there. That's why I refer to it as learned helplessness. And when I moved over to my previous employer, the R Street Institute, a private sector think tank, that was the topic I took up, was how do we tap into that collective misery and try to get people to move forward and do stuff? And to that end, we ended up partnering, doing a left-right partnership of R Street and New America. And we kind of came up with this new concept for thinking about Congress. A lot of people like to think about Congress in personal terms, like, they're a bunch of crooks, or they're lazy, or whatever it may be. We wanted to think of Congress more as a firm and say, does this firm have the capacity to meet all the demands being placed on it on a day-to-day basis, and kind of these larger expectations we have for it to play per the Constitution and in the whole separation of power system. And that proved to, I think, be pretty attractive to a number of folks on the Hill. It was a different way of looking at things that took it above the personalities and kind of said, let's look at the organization, let's look at the resourcing, let's look at the system. And there's nothing inherently kind of Democratic or Republican about it. It's a systems thing, not a partisan thing. And so, what we've seen is that a kind of rising consciousness of the fact that, Congress has fallen far short of the aspirations for it that we see in Article 1 of the Constitution. And we're seeing this kind of baby stepping forward with reforms. In the past, when Congress reformed itself, it was often kind of big bang moments, 1946 or the early 70s, where Congress just kind of collectively stood up and said, the executive's too powerful. We got to put him in his place, and we're going to organize ourselves to be able to better do that. Those days are long gone, thanks to polarization and other factors. And so the kind of path forward is a lot of small ball in the weeds type reform. And that's what we've been getting. And I guess most kind of expressive of that variant of reform that we're seeing is the fact that for the last 2 years, we've had this select committee on the modernization of Congress, which has been a bipartisan effort to just kind of ask questions about how the House in particular, and Congress a little more generally, does what it does. Whether it's human resources management, training of staff, whether it's budget process, it's just kind of working its way through these. And it's put out, a final report just last week with 97 recommendations, and it unanimously brought these out. Everybody on the committee, left and right, agreed that these were things that Congress should consider doing to reform itself. So yeah, reform is going forward, but the eternal peril is, of course, partisanship. If we imagine a Democratic sweep, Democratic president, how much energy will there be to continue these reforms? It's kind of easy to grab the first branch flag and wave it high when you're in the, your party doesn't have the presidency. So it's going to be a long path forward, but at least the process has begun.
It's interesting that you're talking about sort of small measures that Congress can take, small ball in the weeds kinds of reforms. I wanted to transition to talking a little bit about that idea. We've been talking about a lot of sort of big constitutional ideas about attaching individual actors in Congress to their institution so that they would understand their powers and potentially their role in separation of powers. We've talked about reasons why maybe that's not being followed, but to talk about small reforms, Molly, I wanted to now turn attention to this idea of reform and maybe some of these smaller steps. There's been discussion. I know that Kevin has been involved in this, and you've studied this and talked about this as well, about thinking about some really basic ideas about capacity, not so much in terms of constitutional powers, but like literal capacity to say research or have staff or to be able to compete with the resources of the executive. When we think about how much Congress pays or its staff or how often it trains them, these may seem like kind of prosaic questions compared to the sort of big ticket constitutional ideas we've talked about so far. But how do you think that small changes in, say, staffing and resources could actually help Congress to achieve some of the hope that we're talking about in terms of its regaining its capacity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what I'll say builds on a lot of what Kevin has already said about how we should think about Congress, not just as a representative body or a co-equal branch of government, but also as an organization where individuals go to work every day. And we should ask ourselves kind of what are the incentives that those individual people, both the elected members and the staffs that support them in their personal offices, in both Washington and the states and districts, and on the committees on which they serve. What are the incentives that those individuals face, and how might we make changes to some of those incentives that have positive consequences for the institution as a whole and its ability to work? And so things like increasing staff size, particularly on committees, increasing the amount that staff get paid are often part of this conversation. And in both of those cases, the idea is really that if we make it easier, both through compensation and through just expanding the set of opportunities that congressional staff would have to remain on the Hill for long careers, they would build more expertise in their policy areas that they specialize in, and they would again just have more experience to lend to the legislative process. Would this make a difference? You mentioned at the very top an edited volume that Kevin worked on with a couple of co-editors, and there's some great research in that volume. There's great research elsewhere that actually sort of sketches out how this might actually work. And so things like, we know from some research that legislators who have more experienced legislative staff actually are able to advance their legislative priorities farther through the legislative process, and that actually works mostly through a combination of making committee chairs more effective, and also making junior members who really are kind of just coming in and maybe don't know that much about how the institution works, making them more effective. There's also some work that suggests that that one of the greatest shortcomings of the current congressional staff environment is that because folks don't have a lot of experience, which again is tied to things like compensation and upward career mobility, that provides more opportunities for outside interests to be influential in the policy process. And so if you are, a 25-year-old legislative assistant in a House member's office and you don't have a strong background in one of the 12 issues that you're working on, and you need information, you need it quickly, you might turn to places like the Congressional Research Service. That's what the CRS is there for. But you might also turn to lobbyists of various stripes. And again, because you're simply someone trying to do your job under a lot of time and resource constraints, that may be the easiest way to get the kind of information that you feel that you need to do your job. And if we can try and build up capacity among staff and create a system that allows them to stay on the Hill longer and in longer careers, those are the kind of issues that would address. And then they would have second, third, fourth order consequences for making the institution stronger as a co-equal branch of government to the executive branch and the judiciary.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. We talk about, capacity in those terms, like simply experience, knowledge. We all know that policymaking is information overload, and it's really difficult if you don't have that expertise to deal with the constraints and contingencies that you have to face constantly in a legislative environment. But it's kind of interesting to me, certainly talking to Jeff and Kevin, sort of the story sorts to proceed apace in terms of talking about Congress and its development, and then we hit this wall that everyone calls polarization. It's like, everything would be great but for that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how the role that political polarization has perhaps played in weakening Congress's hand against the executive. We've talked, I think, a little bit in the fact that it's diminished incentives, it's extinguished incentives or misdirected people's political energies in many different ways. So I'm kind of curious, in your mind, let's say Congress, accepted, Kevin's perspective on the Committee on the Modernization of Congress says, yes, let's double those salaries, let's add more committee members, let's up our capacities. I guess the question would be, if we've talked about these institutional incentives really not being recognized by Congress, do you think that they'd actually be put to good use given our polarized political environment?
Yeah, so I think I can actually give a couple of concrete examples from recent months. As everyone has, I've lost a little bit of a sense of time in this period, but I think these are all both the examples that I'm going to use are from the past year or so of concrete ways where we could, things that Congress has worked on that I think if it had more resources that we could imagine that having consequences for the institution as a whole. And one of them is, so Kevin and Jeffrey talked a little bit about oversight. And one of the places where I think that Congress could actually deploy some increased resources is in the oversight space, particularly around figuring out how to streamline its oversight operations, given the increasingly sort of legalistic approach that Congress is taking to, or is being forced to take in attempting to oversee the executive branch. And so we had in July this Supreme Court decision in the Mazars case, where the House Oversight Committee had sought records from the financial firm Mazars related to President Trump's personal financial dealings. And one of the things that the court said in that case is that future subpoenas of the president would need to satisfy a kind of four-part test to determine whether they were sort of appropriately levied by Congress against the executive branch. And the Oversight Committee took that decision, and then they turned around and produced something like a 46-page memo outlining how they thought their subpoena met those criteria. In a world where Congress is going to need to be doing this sort of work every time it wants to pursue a subpoena against the executive branch in order to get information that an executive branch might be withholding, we need to think about how might Congress streamline that process? How might it build up its capacity to do that kind of, in this case, legal work as a way of working as a counterweight to the executive branch? That's one example. Another example, to go back to the support agencies. So we talked a little bit about the Congressional Research Service already. We also, I think, a useful example here is thinking about the Government Accountability Office, which, particularly in the context of the appropriations process, has an important enforcement role, basically adjudicating and determining when the executive branch has violated certain appropriations laws. And so, if that would be another place where, if we sent some more resources into the legislative branch, we could actually see a pretty direct line to how a well-resourced, in this case, GAO, could make sure that it made appropriations law decisions quickly and actually worked as an effective deterrent to the executive branch to violating the law in the first place. So those are just two examples. I think that your point about polarization is a good one. We can kind of talk more about that as well. But I think those are a couple of examples of how, if we actually did increase staffing resources, Congress might use them to effectively build itself up as a counterweight to the executive branch.
Thanks, Molly. And I think that's well taken, and I hope Congress is listening. But I want to talk a little. I want to extend the thought, and Molly, you feel free to contribute to this question too. But Philip has been waiting so patiently since the top of the hour. I feel badly we're getting to him last. So I want to address a question to Philip, so we can also have some time as we head towards the conclusion to have a little discussion amongst ourselves. But I think this question touches on something you just said, Molly, but is maybe, and Kevin, you mentioned this as well. We think about, there actually have been periods of reform where Congress has made a fist and said, no more executive. We're actually going to stand up and remember our role in the separation of powers. So, rather than simply bemoaning Congress's lack of initiative today in defending its own prerogatives, Philip, I'm wondering if you can tell us maybe about some of these previous periods where Congress actually has asserted itself, and whether you see today as being a critical moment for the potential for Congress to do so again.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we've been hearing people talk about the decline of Congress and the accumulation of power in the executive branch for more than a century now. Going back as far as the Theodore Roosevelt administration. So it's not something brand new by any means, but it's not just a story of a long, slow shift in one direction. It's definitely a story with some waves in it. There have been moments in which Congress has reasserted its institutional interests and acted like it was interested in defending its constitutional prerogatives. The two most important ones that I'd like to talk about a little bit are from the 1940s and the 1970s. In both of those cases, you had broad and at least somewhat bipartisan coalitions of legislators who were sort of fed up with just how pushy and just how overbearing the president had become. So in the 1940s, you had the record of Franklin Roosevelt sort of dominating the government during the New Deal, and then being given all sorts of powers to continue to dominate government during the Second World War. And Congress is definitely the driver of that. It's the one giving the authorities to the president and this growing administrative state. But that doesn't mean it necessarily, all of its members are so happy with the shift of power that represents. And so you see a sort of a backlash growing and sort of waiting for its moment during the war. Of course, during the war, the most important thing is focusing on victory and not necessarily vindicating institutional interests right at that moment. But in 1946, you have these two enormously important acts that Congress passes, both with large bipartisan majorities. And those are the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, which makes it much more explicit just what kind of hoops administrative agencies need to jump through to be allowed to make policies, and empowers courts to act as a check on them. But then also lesser known is the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946, which really was a huge turn in Congress's capacity toward building a much larger professional staff, trying to create a kind of committee system that would allow Congress to efficiently check the different growing parts of the executive branch. It even had a budget component that didn't really come off, but it was definitely Congress looking at itself in the mirror and saying, if we want to counter this increasingly powerful executive branch, we are going to have to reshape ourselves to some extent to be capable of doing that. Turning to the later period, both Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon took quite a lot of actions that rubbed Congress the wrong way, that made Congress wonder if their institutional prerogatives were slipping away. A lot of those had to do with the way the nation inched into the conflict in Vietnam, and Congress feeling that it had been sort of led by the nose by the Johnson administration. A lot of other conflicts around the way the president used his budget authority, and specifically this power of impoundment, which first Johnson and then especially Nixon used as a way of stopping congressional spending just because the president didn't really like the policy that was being pursued. So Congress in the 70s really, again, as in 1946, sort of thinks that it needs to fundamentally reshape itself and reshape some of the legal and constitutional framework in order for it to contend effectively with the president. So I'll just run through a number of changes. There was a Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, which again beefed up committees, thought about making Congress more transparent in various ways to sort of increase its credibility with the public. The Senate Judiciary Committee created a subcommittee on the separation of powers in 1971, sort of in recognition that these were issues in need of sustained attention. And then, of course, the big turning point in the 70s was Watergate. And Congress, in many ways, came alive and became most assertive in defending its institutional prerogatives in response to Watergate, in terms of saying that it needed to be able to gain access to information about the president's activities, some very sharp fights there. But they were also tied in to this much broader question of just how powerful the president's control over intelligence agencies was, whether the FBI and CIA were sort of out of control and needed to be brought to account by Congress. And of course, they do successfully not only hound Nixon from office, but they also, of course, appointed his vice president, Gerald Ford, after the previous vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned because of his own corruption troubles. So Congress at that point really had showed just how powerful it was. President Ford, shortly after taking office, actually came to testify before the House Judiciary Committee in October 1974. And it really symbolized the humbling of the presidency. And of course, we also got these big legislative framework laws that were meant to put the president in sort of in check by Congress. So there's the War Powers Resolution, Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Throughout the 70s, Congress sort of proliferates legislative vetoes that are supposed to give them the ability to knock down administrative decisions that they don't like. They put a whole lot of sunset provisions in, meant to sort of supercharge that authorizations power that Kevin talked about now being in such disuse. And there's this huge expansion of committee staff in the 1970s, from an average of 12 to an average of 42 for each House committee, and every senator getting a dedicated staffer for every single committee assignment that they had. I think there's a lot of important questions to be asked about just how effective those changes of the 1970s were in terms of giving Congress sort of the upper hand. Certainly, Republicans sort of find themselves alienated from a lot of the ways that Congress was asserting themselves, and sort of became very much presidentialists by philosophy in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was the president. But in any case, it's really impressive to look at just how much tumult there was in the 1970s, just how willing Congress was to experiment with new things, creating the Congressional Budget Office, the technology Office of Technology Assessment. So lots of things happening. And so when I turn to today and think about, well, is today the next reform moment? I think we have to think about both sort of what is Congress able to do today and what is Congress willing to do. And to my mind, there's a lot of good stuff happening on this small ball front. And a lot of these changes that the Select Committee has recommended would be really healthy and make the institutions, the House and the Senate, especially the House has been their focus, stronger. But it's not clear to me whether there's this underlying will to say, hey, as an institution, we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and just start trying all kinds of things to make ourselves meaningfully stronger. I think there's a lot of potential for shuffling of deck chairs on the Titanic if we focus too much on the small ball stuff. At the end of the day, Congress has to give itself that last word that Jeff Toulis talked about. If at the end of the day, what they're willing to do is make a lot of fuss about just how much the executive branch is running over them, but not give themselves the last word by actually cutting off funding for executive branch agencies or actually impeaching the president. I think then it's a question of just how seriously the executive branch has to take them. And of course, there's this broader phenomenon of, is it, on the one hand, you have a lot of members of Congress who do say how much they wish the institution would make itself stronger. On the other hand, out of the other corner of their mouth, they say, but this next election we're coming up to is the most important election in the history of the country. And they say that every time, in case you haven't noticed. And so if that's the way you feel about the next election, then, it just makes sense to put off the institutional stuff. We say, all right, well, we'll get to that. But for now, we just have to do everything to maximize our partisan advantage because we just have to win this election. And if that's the fundamental attitude, then it's hard to see a reform moment of real constitutional weightiness gaining hold.
Yeah, you're thinking about the 40s and the growth of the federal administration and the assertiveness of FDR and Congress's reaction. You think about, as you described, the tumult of the 70s, particularly under Watergate, and how there was sort of an equal and opposite reaction from Congress. But when you think about sort of the deep divisions between Congress and the executive during this last administration, it's hard to see a commensurate reaction as you're describing. And it seems like those energies are being pushed off into a partisan direction rather than an institutional one. And so that does make us concerned, I think, for the future of reform for Congress. So let's in the last 10 minutes we have before we move to question and answer, I wanted to pose some general questions to the panel. And I want to talk to Jeff first about this. I think, in sort of trying to find, what's missing from this equation. Why is it that Congress isn't standing up for itself? One of the things that you pointed out, I think really interestingly, and it sort of had me thinking about, anti-federalist arguments about, the lack of education, civic education that the new administrative republic would create, and the lack of constitutional knowledge that people would have, but yet would need to deal and work within something as complicated as a theory of separation of powers. And so I guess this is for everybody, not just for Jeff, but I'll start with Jeff. Is there a public role in restoring a constitutional view of Congress? If Congress is so set on, we would hope, reacting and trying to serve the interest of the public in terms of the ways in which they set the agenda, in terms of the way they see their roles, in terms of their laser-like focus on the next election as opposed to the institution. Is there something we can do to restore the public in all of this, either through the conversation or through their understanding of the Constitution?
I think there is, and I'll just make 2 points about that. One picks up on what Philip was just saying. I want to just say a few more words about one of his terrific examples, which was the fight over impoundment. Because that fight really does illustrate what the complex constitutional design was supposed to, how it was supposed to work. And the details of that are rather important. So Nixon vetoed a law that provided support for the dairy industry or dairy farmers, and the Congress overrode his veto. So it should have become law. It did become law. It didn't become law, and Nixon anyway impounded the funds that were appropriated. Just wouldn't spend them. And Congress responded by saying, well, that's a crass political move that you're doing for partisan purposes, having to do with your electoral prospects and who you want to reward and who you want to punish, sort of stuff like Trump does. And Nixon's response was not to say, well, the hell with you, that's what I'm doing because I'm president. Nixon's response was to say, listen, as president of the United States, I'm the only one that has responsibility and is held accountable for the health of the entire economy. I've got the Office of Management and Budget. I'm looking at the big picture. I've got to make these kinds of decisions. And so when they deliberated this response, they had to answer that. And their answer was, you're right. You're right that you actually have more tools than Congress does. You actually do have some of that responsibility, but we also have a responsibility as Kevin or somebody mentioned, as the main appropriating body. And so we're going to combine some restrictions on the use of the impoundment power with a concession to your argument for why you did use it by creating this new institution, the Congressional Budget Office, which everybody at the time thought would be a partisan tool of Congress, but of course, over time has become one of the most respected institutions in Washington, such that even presidential candidates cite its numbers rather than the OMB, which became more politicized. So that was a real success story for the constitutional order. And it testified to the fact, in that instance, of people translating their partisan dispute into constitutional concerns and having to respond to each other in a way that was productive at the end. Now, why doesn't that happen? And this will be my last point. When the Constitution set this whole thing up, everybody, I'm sure, remembers that there is no, not only is there no mention of political parties, but Madison and others were openly hostile of political parties. And they were hostile political parties because they were afraid that they would take on an overly ideological cast, often maybe representing alternative regime types, and that they would be susceptible to being led by demagogues. When Martin Van Buren and others reinvent the parties for the American context, and perhaps one of your old teachers, Jim Caesar at Virginia, has written the best book on this, on presidential selection. When Van Buren and others do this, the whole point of making that party system was to make Congress work better, so that the party system was a kind of institutional device invented to better coordinate policy and in a way to be subservient to the functions of the presidency and Congress. And what's happened in our time is that this dynamic of the connection between the ambition of the politician and the institution has migrated from Congress to the political party, particularly in the case of the Republican Party, but really to both parties. And in this world of hyperpartisanship, the result of that has been not only that these politicians feel more loyal to their party than to Congress, but in the case of McConnell's and others, they found that they've been emboldened enough to actually exploit the institutional resources of Congress for the purposes of the political party, rather than as originally designed to exploit the institutional resources of party to advance the constitutional purposes of the legislature and the presidency.
Would anyone else?
That would suggest, by the way, that when we think of reform, we have to be thinking not just of tinkering with the mechanisms of Congress, but of reforming the party system.
Anyone else like to weigh in on that question, Philip?
I just want to say that I don't envision a grassroots movement leading to congressional renewal. There will never be a grassroots movement for congressional renewal, right? You do, sometimes in American history, see grassroots movements dedicated to some particular policy goal that finds that in order to achieve its goal, it needs to reconfigure some things about the legislature. And that kind of motivation is in a sense more powerful as a disruptive force than just a sort of general reform sensibility that, like, oh, something is wrong and we should fix it just because to make our constitutional system work better. In my view, it's more likely that any kind of grassroots pressure will come because of a desire for policy change. But there is a question of whether there's sort of a backbencher movement or something like that, just within Congress, whether the members themselves create a groundswell for reform, whether they are willing to say, hey, we don't like being partisan ticket punchers in our professional lives. We thought we were signing up for something more important than that, where we would actually get to debate the nation's big problems and not just show up and vote the party line. And so to some extent, it's the members themselves who have more of a realistic potential to say, hey, we have to reinvent our institution.
Yeah, Zachary, I have just two things to add building on what Phil just said. So one is I actually think we have good examples that both support the idea that we might have a movement for reform from within the body and some less encouraging examples. So I remind folks that the way we came to have, in part, the way we came to have the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress in the first place is that it was pushed for by a set of members as part of Speaker Pelosi's attempt to shore up support for her re-election to the speakership when when Democrats took control of the House. And so that, and the political scientist Eric Schickler has written a great book that also looks at kind of what are some of the intra-party forces that have created movements for reform in the past. So that's kind of an encouraging example. A less encouraging piece of evidence that I point to is actually some great work that our Yuval, who delivered our introduction today, has done on the way in which increasingly we have members of Congress who sort of run for Congress because they want to use Congress as a platform to have a kind of public-facing life. And the kind of bluntest way to put this is they like going on Fox News, they like going on MSNBC, and being a member of the House is a good way to get to do that, as opposed to really wanting to run because they are intensely interested in policy and changing policy. So I think that there's a lot of things that cut against each other and are sort of cross-cutting forces here. But I think depending on where we look, we can see more and less encouraging prospects for reform coming from within the institution.
Just one last question I wanted to pose to the panel, and then we'll turn over to question and answer from our viewers today. The only constitutional question that seems to be a part of the presidential campaign right now has to do with the composition of the Supreme Court. And of course, we've been watching the nomination hearings in the Senate. When we talk about Congress asserting itself, there's been a loose talk, I think, on both sides about the potential for packing the court. That is to say, for Congress to pass legislation that would increase the number of people on the court. I think in a way, in a partisan fight that also includes the executive, but not as directly with the executive in this case. We haven't really talked about the courts particularly, but I just, in a general question, I mean, is this the kind of assertion that we're looking from Congress for? Or is this another sort of dysfunctional response to continuing problems in our separation of powers theory? Kevin?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of symptomatic, as Congress has kind of let authority that it's supposed to possess ebb away to other branches, the presidency and the judiciary. Guess what? The political interest in those other branches goes higher and higher, and the interest in Congress, wanes. And that's where, the real action is, not in that dysfunctional first branch. It's, you got to win the presidency. It's an existential sort of thing these days, and you've got to jam as many people in the courts as you possibly can. And and it's not, to be frank, it's, if Democrats should go forward and we end up getting a court packing, filibuster goes away and court packing scheme, I'm not sure where it ends. I don't see this as somehow being a kind of self-correcting mechanism. It's just kind of a further down the path. I mean, let's add 3 seats this time. Maybe we'll add 3 seats next time when a different party's in control. Yeah, I think it's symptomatic.
Anyone else on the panel wish to weigh in on that one? Jeff?
Well, I do. I think it's interesting to think about the contrasting examples in the 19th century that are relevant to this current dispute. Most people tend to think, and the reason court packing is the term and is generally thought to be pejorative, is they think of the FDR episode. But there was two things I'd call attention to. One is parallel to the Merrick Garland denial, and the other is parallel to this proposal for court packing, because the proposal to court pack is really to unpack. I mean, it's adding more, but it's in response to the Merrick Garland thing. And we have an example of unpacking the courts in the Andrew Johnson administration, the president that was most similar of all presidents to Donald Trump. He nominated somebody, they turned them down, and then they took away 2 seats when somebody else died. And so he couldn't nominate anybody else, and then they restored those seats under Grant. And nobody afterwards said, oh my God, this is just going to go on forever. When you get into office, you're either going to add seats or subtract seats. They did it in response to a demagogue president allied with some allies in Congress. The other interesting example is in the Tyler administration, there were a whole number of nominees that were tabled in a way that similar to Merrick Garland not being allowed a hearing and a vote and so forth. There are 2 differences. One is the ones that were tabled were nominees that were thought to be too extreme. And ultimately, very close to the end of his term, they actually approved a nominee who was actually a lot like Merrick Garland, who was thought to be a moderate, not so extreme and so forth. And the second thing is, in order to table them, they actually had to take a vote, and people had to actually be accountable, that which wasn't the case in the Merrick Garland instance, in which there were no votes on anything. It was just all left up to one particular man to shut that whole thing down 11 months before the election. And most people in Congress knew why he was shutting it down, because an open hearing would probably have resulted in a positive vote for the nominee, since the nominee had been suggested by Republicans to Obama as the sort of person that he would appoint. So I actually think a robust fight on the court is going to continue. And depending how it's conducted, I don't necessarily think that it would be bad at all for the polity.
Well, let's talk a little bit. We've been talking, I think, about the House a lot. Let's talk a little bit about the Senate in this role. And Molly, I've got a question here from the audience about the filibuster. It's from Rachel Oswald with Roll Call. She asks, is there a majoritarian government likely or under Biden, or would it be best for Biden to consider this in terms of, say, doing away with the filibuster in order to, for instance, deal with what I think we've already begun to see in headlines and suggestions, that Mitch McConnell, if he's back in a minority position in the Senate, he would be working to block virtually any kind of Biden agenda as using the power of the filibuster. So, I mean, what are we thinking about in terms of the filibuster ending altogether in a way for Congress to try to assert itself against the executive?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the things to keep in mind when we think about the future of the legislative filibuster in 2021 or beyond are 2 principal questions. One, how big is the majority? So in this case, thinking about how many seats Democrats have in a world where they do have unified party control. How big is that majority? And perhaps more importantly, what is the issue on which they are sufficiently united and think is important enough that they would pull the trigger to eliminate the legislative filibuster because they're not seeing action in the face of obstruction. And so the question on what that issue is, I still don't know. I think there is, as we see more and more reporting around the possibility of a Republican minority in this scenario obstructing everything, including, say, additional stimulus to respond to the pandemic, that becomes a likely candidate for the thing that enough Democrats agree to, and agree is really important to get rid of the filibuster. Obviously, when President Obama said at John Lewis's funeral that he thought if it took, and he said this, I think, since then as well, that he thinks that if it takes getting rid of the filibuster to pass new voting rights legislation, then Senate Democrats should do that. So really, what is the issue? And then once you've sort of figured out how you build the coalition to get rid of it in the first place, then there is this question of kind of what's behind that dam. What are things that aren't necessarily important enough to be the triggering event, but that a unified democratic government could try to act on in the absence of the filibuster. I'll say, because Zachary mentioned my work on the budget reconciliation process in the introduction, that remains a little bit of an X factor in this whole debate for me. Reconciliation allows for changes to mandatory spending programs and to the revenue side of the budget without the possibility of a filibuster in the Senate, subject to certain constraints. Could Democrats find a way to take some of the pressure off the calls to remove the filibuster by doing a reconciliation bill early and quickly? Perhaps it's hard to do. It's hard to get policy to fit in that box that the reconciliation rules create if you want to do something more complicated than just cut taxes and have the tax cuts expire after 10 years. And so there's a lot of questions here, but I think the sort of short answer is that it would be, there are certain to be things that Democrats would like to do that a filibuster would prevent. Whether they are sufficiently committed to doing those things and are in sufficient agreement on what those things should be to actually pull the trigger and eliminate it remains, I think, an open question.
It's an interesting point that you draw, I think, in talking about, well, actually, we brought him up earlier, Senator Byrd and the Byrd Rule, his institutional concerns about protecting unlimited debate and the filibuster and the curb and limits that he wished to be placed on this idea of the exception in the Congressional Budget Act that allows for budget reconciliation. And maybe we shouldn't always think about filibuster in binary terms. Maybe there are other ways to think about the filibuster that aren't just about, are we going to do it or are we not? Are there some ways that we can try to rethink it while trying to maintain something like unlimited debate?
Yeah, and I think those conversations are ongoing in the Senate. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon has been pretty sort of on the forefront of this question of kind of let's put all of the options on the table, all of the things that we could do to maybe cabin in the filibuster without getting rid of it entirely. I think that on this question of the Byrd Rule and kind of reconciliation more generally, I think one thing that really illustrates well is that kind of the partisan environment in which the Senate and the House exist has changed over time, and the rules of the chamber are kind of constantly playing catch up to the partisan incentives that members face, and that we see, to my mind, we see rule change when the incentives to get something done that the rules are preventing from happening get big enough, and that we can kind of see this evolution happen, and we have rules that were designed and developed for a period that looks different than the one that we currently live in. So like when they put the Byrd Rule in place in the mid-'80s, we did not have the kind of levels of polarization and partisanship that we have now. And then we've gotten now to a point where, because reconciliation is seen as this kind of magic bullet for getting big partisan party defining priorities done, but you have to try to cabin that, you try to fit it into that box created by the Byrd Rule. You end up with really kludgy policy solutions to big problems, but this is the only way that a majority can do this because of the filibuster.
Anyone else on the filibuster and thinking about congressional reform or ways in which Congress can assert itself? I've got one more, I think we've got time for just one more question. I've got a question here about congressional capacity and the idea of fundraising. It's not something we've really talked about, but I think it's a valid one and probably not one that we can address fully in the last 3 minutes here or so. But just to acknowledge the idea that a lot of the time of a congressperson is spent fundraising, and that Congress regulating itself in terms of campaign finance reform and some recent Supreme Court decisions, Congress spends a lot of time fundraising, and there's a lot of focus on the next election and getting reelected and the time spent on that. So I'm just wondering if any of you would like to comment on this idea about Congress and fundraising. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, the fundraising issue sort of fits into the larger question about Congress's calendar and scheduling. You know, Philip can tell you that concerns about members of Congress flying into town and working from Tuesdays to Thursdays on this truncated week go way back. And they, you know, it's hard to get a lot done if you're only here a few days a week. And where fundraising comes in is that fundraising does carve out a significant portion of the time that members have when they're here. You know, they have to go trudge across the street and, you know, go to the DNC, the RNC, and sit in a cubicle and dial for dollars. Again, they have to run around town, go to fundraisers. You know, it's one more thing that kind of saps their capacity to spend on doing things that, you know, either the Constitution or the public might otherwise direct them to spend their times on. So it's a thing, and you know, so far Congress hasn't done much to deal with the problem. There was a bill that was being kicked around a few years ago that would basically ban fundraising when Congress was in town for certain hours of the day, with the idea of like kind of self-binding members to require them to go, you know, stick to their legislative knitting. But it didn't get particularly far, unfortunately.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to all our panelists. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, George Thomas, who's director of the Salvatori Center, for co-sponsoring this. I think it's been a really interesting and I think in-depth discussion of congressional reform. And so I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for spending time with us. And thanks again to the American Enterprise Institute and Yuval Levin for helping us organize this event today. Thank you.